co-founder of the Jindal Society of International Law. Today amongst us, we have a celebrated author, publicist, and a personal mentor of mine. But before I introduce him and the topic, I would like to share a few words about the Center for UN Studies, which aims to develop a learning platform on opportunities and limits of the United Nations by enhancing research and building knowledge on how the United Nations systems work, both in terms of institutional development and in terms of promotion and implementation of various multilateral policies. In my discussions with the founding director of the center, Professor Dr. Wesley Bobowski, he has often reminded me that in 1953, the first UN Secretary General Trygve Lie welcomed Dag Hammarskjöld, his successor, by saying the following, and I quote, "Welcome, Dag, to the most impossible job on this earth," end quote. This has been the fate of the United Nations. It has become the scapegoat when states have failed to live up to the initial expectations of its founders. But let us remind ourselves what Hammarskjöld famously said, as perhaps as a response. Hammarskjöld said, and I quote him, "The UN was not created to take us to heaven, but to save us from hell," end quote. The Center for UN Studies engages in the projects and studies the history and the traditions and takes a transformative approach to research, teaching, and societal engagement, having in mind the latest and most dynamic geopolitical and technological shifts. The Jindal Society of International Law, which is created under the center, is a student-led initiative and is spearheaded by Professor Dr. Wesley Bobowski. We were founded in 2022 and is a platform for young enthusiasts of international law. That remains our aim, and that remains our goal. The inaugural address and official launch of the society was completed on the 18th day of November in 2020, and the society was inaugurated by the Herbert and Rose Rubin Professor of International Law, Jose Enrique Alvarez of NYU, along with the Vice Chancellor, Faculty Director for the Center and Society, and a very dear friend of the society, Professor Dr. Mohan Kumar. Let me also share that just yesterday, the society was awarded, and it is a proud moment indeed as a founder and also the president of the society for its recognition by the university in tall order with those who have existed much longer than we have and in size as well. Our fall lecture series of 2021, Exploring the Ecosystem of International Law, builds upon the introduction given on internationalism and international law by the concluded spring lecture series titled Future of Internationalism and International Law. The fall lecture series endeavors to study the different contours of international law. To assist in this study, the speakers will cover and address respective areas of expertise based upon the years of research and practice. Given the vast ecosystem and the engagement of international law in it, the society aims to study the fragmentation and fertilization of the various disciplines in this ecosystem. The society for its members is a well of knowledge and a quorum of thought-provoking discussions, which will be the resultant of its engagements with experts aimed at exploring the ecosystem of international law and affairs. Our professor today, Professor Alan Henrikson, is the lead Dirks Professor of Diplomatic History, Emeritus, and founding director of the Diplomatic Studies program at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy, Tufts University, where he has taught American diplomacy, history, contemporary U.S. European relationships, global political geography, and the history, theory, and practice of diplomacy. Professor Henrikson is a Ph.D. scholar and is also a Rhodes Scholar from the PPE program, the very famous PPE program at Balliol College, Oxford University. He has studied as well as taught at the International Summer School at the University of Oslo. He is a past president of the United Nations Association of Greater Boston and member of the National Council of United Nations Association of the United States of America. He has served as the vice president of the World Affairs Council of Boston, and the Board of Directors of the Boston Committee on Foreign Relations. He is a member of the Council on Foreign Relations in New York, and today will speak to us on the role of public diplomacy in the modern world. Respected sir, I welcome you, and I'm thankful to you for joining us, and I hand the floor to you now.
Thank you very much, Ankit. I'm delighted to see you, to talk with you. I remember you and your fellow student from Jindal Global University very well when you were at the Fletcher School a while ago. It's wonderful to be reconnected, and thank you for the kind invitation to speak about this subject. I am not a lawyer. I'm a diplomatic historian, but I'm extremely interested in international law and the normative ecosystem, as you've called it, of international relations, including the conduct of diplomacy. Among the types of diplomacy, there is public diplomacy. The topic that you've invited me to address is, as you mentioned earlier, the role of public diplomacy in the modern world. The word role is something that is sometimes overlooked. It's a term that comes from the theater. Public diplomacy, like any actor in a play, plays only a part. And public diplomacy is not really central to international relations, but it does play a part, and it's one which has changed significantly over time. I have subtitled my talk, this is something I've added to it, with the following words. So it's the role of public diplomacy in the modern world, with a particular interest in the question of its international legal context. I've emphasized the word question because I am not certain what the international legal framework for the conduct of public diplomacy is. And I've been sounding out quite a few people who are practitioners and very knowledgeable in this field. And it turns out to be a relatively unexplored field of inquiry. So I think we may be, in our discussion, engaged in something new. I have divided my presentation today in, let me call them 5 steps. Step 1, the term of public diplomacy and the concept of it. Step 2, its changing role over time and its variation with country size. Step 3, what is the normative, legal, and indeed possibly organizational basis within which or on which public diplomacy is conducted, nationally and internationally? Step 4, what are the challenges in the international or global communication space, it might be called, in which diplomacy, including public diplomacy, has to be conducted? And then finally, step 5, responses to these challenges. How effective are the responses that have been made? And does the normative, legal, organizational context, the ecosystem, matter? That will be, in effect, my central question, which I will address a little bit more fully in the middle of my presentation today. First of all, the term and the concept, the word, the phrase. It's a term, public diplomacy is, on which the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy has, in a sense, almost a patent or a patent. I'm not sure how you pronounce that in India. In 1965, the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy established something called the Edward R. Murrow Center for the Study and Advancement of Public Diplomacy. The dean of the school at that time was Ambassador Edmund Gullion, who had been President Kennedy's ambassador to the Congo, a not only very senior, but a very distinguished and very learned diplomat. He is said to have said, and he might well have done it, that he might have used the word propaganda instead of public diplomacy. But he realized, as anybody would at that time, and even now, The term propaganda has negative connotations, especially in the 1960s or any time after World War II. It would have conjured up images of Joseph Goebbels, and the propaganda, the hateful propaganda of the Nazi regime in Germany. But I think his suggestion that maybe he might have used the word propaganda is important to realize in a historical framework. The term propaganda derives from, among other sources, the Catholic Church, which established in the early 19th century the Society for the Propagation of the Faith. The Anglican Church, even earlier, had an organization called the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel in Foreign Parts. And the Anglican Church was actually established in Boston, Massachusetts, to spread the gospel of Anglicanism there, and indeed in other parts of the world where Britain had influence, where the empire was. Professor Nicholas J. Cull at the University of Southern California, a scholar of the history of public diplomacy, wrote an article a number of years ago, which is quite an important one, titled Public Diplomacy in Quotation Marks Before Gullion. And he found, by doing a word search, that the term pops up way back in 1856 in the London Times, where the term is used in the context in which the meaning was pretty clearly, essentially just civility. It's important to speak and act politely in international relations. This was in the context of relations between Britain and the United States. Dean Gullion, as he then was, did not coin the term. So the term did exist before, but he did give it, as Nicholas Cull has acknowledged, fresh usage. The Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy, with the Murrow Center for the Study and Advancement of Public Diplomacy, did, in a sense, institutionalize the term public diplomacy, which was then picked up not only by the U.S. Department of State, which had been using the term public affairs. It added public diplomacy. It now has an Undersecretary of State for public diplomacy, but other governments as well are using the term. NATO, for example, uses the term public diplomacy. So it's really, in a sense, gone viral and did so very, very quickly. So it seemed to fulfill a need. Edmund Gullion's definition of public diplomacy is actually, it's more of a description than a definition. It's very short. I'm sure he described it in many different ways, but this was a statement that he made, which I'd like to share with you, because it includes some of the elements of public diplomacy as it continues to exist today. But there's something distinctive about it, which I hadn't noticed initially, but I do note now and would like to draw attention to. He wrote, "Public diplomacy deals with the influence of public attitudes on the formation and execution of foreign policies. It encompasses dimensions of international relations beyond traditional diplomacy. It encompasses the cultivation by governments of public opinion in other countries. It encompasses the interaction of private groups and interests in one country with another. It encompasses the reporting of foreign affairs and its impact on policy. Communication between those whose job is communication, as diplomats and foreign correspondents. Also, the processes of intercultural communications. This emphasis on reportage, and those whose job is communication, including foreign correspondence, makes me realize that Ambassador Gullion's perspective on public diplomacy, his personal perspective, was probably that, and I knew him quite well, of a diplomat serving in the field, especially as ambassador, as the head of a mission. And he was very much focused on relations with the press. He had good relations with the press. So he was dealing within the context of what today is called public diplomacy with reporters, with journalists. And I might note that the Edward R. Murrow Center for Public Diplomacy nearly always had on its staff and as a guest, a journalist, somebody who was working in the foreign correspondence field, including, among others, David Halberstam, the famous journalist who wrote about the Vietnam War and wrote a book on which he was working at the Fletcher School called The Best and the Brightest, a phrase which, in a sense, has gone viral then and subsequently. So Gullion's perspective was not so much on public diplomacy, was not so much that of the government as a whole, the US or any other government's overall effort in the communications field. It was, I think, a diplomatic perspective of the diplomat working in the field. And in this context, I think of something that a later dean of the Fletcher School, the late Stephen Bosworth, also a very distinguished diplomat. He was ambassador to the Philippines during the People Power Revolution there. He was ambassador to South Korea, a very senior figure. And he once said in conversation with me, he said, I don't really know what public diplomacy is. I'll never forget that. I don't really know what public diplomacy is. And he did say, in addition, by way of elaboration, the ambassador can do a lot. When he was ambassador in Seoul, he was the one that the press, the media, wanted to hear from on relations, say, with North Korea or with China, or what US policy was. Not so much lesser officers in the mission. And this, in a way, makes a point that practitioners as diplomats in the field have somewhat a difficult time understanding what public diplomacy is because they think of what they do as public diplomacy. Increasingly, conventional diplomats, traditional diplomats are interacting not directly with the public. They don't go out and meet and greet people, en masse. They don't go out and visit universities and corporations and so on, though they do that to some degree. That tends to be the staff of missions to do it. But they do, through interviews and through public statements they make, have a huge effect on the audience, the citizenry of a country to which they're posted. I have found actually a definition of public diplomacy, which I myself wrote some years ago. It happens to be on the Wikipedia site for public diplomacy. I noticed it when I looked it up there. It goes back to 2005. It's not bad, but I think it's incomplete, and I've somewhat changed my understanding of it. It's brief. Public diplomacy may be defined simply as the conduct of international relations by governments through public communications media and through dealings with a wide range of non-governmental entities, political parties, corporations, trade associations, labor unions, educational institutions, religious organizations, ethnic groups, and so on, including influential individuals for the purpose of influencing the politics and actions of other governments. Now, I think that definition is too narrow. I have come to understand better that it's not only governments that are involved in what might be called diplomatic activity. To be sure, strictly speaking, diplomacy is something conducted by governments. But there's also an activity, an engagement internationally which goes beyond what governments do. And that would include NGOs of various kinds and some of the other entities like trade unions and religious groups that I've mentioned. But I would emphasize and indeed insist that for what they do to be called diplomacy, public diplomacy in particular, there should be in what they do a policy interest, a policy focus. they should be interested in policy. They should be interested in developing policy, promoting policy, and they should be interested in the policies that other societies, other governments might be adopting. Moreover, and this I would add, and this is perhaps even more distinctive, or at least as distinctive, what they do should reflect diplomatic understanding. Diplomatic understanding. Now, what does that mean? And I would like to hold up a book which some of you know, and I would like to recommend it for those who may not, by Paul Sharp, a British scholar teaching in the US, called Diplomatic Theory of International Relations. Paul Sharp makes the point that underlying diplomacy has to be recognition that pluralism inheres in human society. We are made up of groups. Moreover, that communication between groups, between countries, between societies, between nations, between groups is different from communication within groups. That's part of what he means by diplomatic understanding. So those involved as NGOs or as diplomats working for governments should have this understanding of the plurality of the world, that others are different. They communicate internally differently from the way you communicate with them. I would add to this definition of diplomatic understanding of Professor Sharp's by noting that diplomatic understanding should also involve a recognition that most problems of an international nature are not solved like a mathematical problem. They're settled more often. And sometimes they're settled only temporarily. There may need to be repeated address of the same problem. And diplomacy is a continuous process. And I think those involved in diplomacy should have that understanding as well, in order to have a broader sense of the kind of the character of the diplomatic activity in which they are involved. Now, going beyond anything I have said, there is I'll say even more radical understanding of what diplomacy, public diplomacy, could and should mean. Some years ago, there was a publication titled Public Diplomacy in a Changing World. It was edited by Jeffrey Cowan and Nicholas Cull, both of them at the University of Southern California, in the Center on Public Diplomacy there. One of the chapter contributors was Manuel Castells, the Spanish sociologist teaching at the University of Southern California. His chapter was titled The New Public Sphere, the New Public Sphere, Global Civil Society, Communication Networks, and Global Governments. For Castells, for Professor Castells, public diplomacy is quite simply the diplomacy of the public. That is, it is something to be conducted by people themselves. Now, in practice, as I have noted in a review of this publication, in practice, the people with a capital P may be activists who are engaged in movements for indigenous rights, for sustainable development, anti-personnel mines ban, abolition of nuclear weapons, and other existential forms of peace and justice. And Professor Castells writes, because people have come to distrust the logic of instrumental politics, that is, through formal diplomats, representatives, the method of direct action on direct inputs finds increasing support. Far from advocating a strengthening of governmental diplomacy, Castells places faith in what he calls the formation of a global civil society without a global government. Now that is, I've characterized a much more radical the concept of what the public diplomacy is. That is people's diplomacy, with people interacting directly. Again, I would emphasize as a requirement, as criteria, that there be not only a policy interest, but there also be diplomatic understanding, a recognition of the differentness of the world, the plurality of it, that problems cannot necessarily be resolved completely or totally, maybe even ever, and that the activity in which they are involved needs to be continuous. Now, if I may, I don't have a blackboard or a whiteboard here, but I would like to give you sort of a manual graphic, a manual diagram, if I might, which illustrates my understanding of what I'm talking about. Imagine at the top of this diagram, two governments, government one and government two. Conventional diplomacy involves direct relations between them. Government one, the United States, deals directly with India through its Ministry of External Affairs. Below, or in a sense, more broadly surrounding government, you have two societies. Society one, American society, society two, Indian society. So public diplomacy, conventionally defined, is a relationship between government one and society two, expecting and hoping, even intending, that there will be an indirect effect through this direct action on society two, on government two, a kind of a dotted line going upward, through lobbying, perhaps, by corporations, maybe demonstrations, manifestations, labor strikes, protests against what the government is doing. But society one can also be involved, as I was suggesting earlier, in diplomatic activity by interacting particularly directly with society two, which then might have an indirect effect on government two. And maybe, as Professor Castells was suggesting, government two and government one might not be so important. That in the long run, it's this interaction between societies that really matters. So this is very simple, but for me at least, it somewhat clarifies in a graphic way the kind of multi-directional interactions that public diplomacy can involve. Now, step two, public diplomacy's changing role. Over time and its variation with country size. Now, a lot can be said about this. A writer named Carnes Lord, C-A-R-N-E-S, Lord, who was a deputy director of the U.S. Information Agency for a time, made the observation, this is actually in the Wikipedia site on public diplomacy, that public diplomacy has become less grand strategic. And here I shall be very brief, though one could elaborate it. When the United States in the late 1940s was providing aid for the rehabilitation of Europe after World War II through the Marshall Plan, the European Recovery Program, there was a natural thought, we're spending all this money, all this taxpayers' money, giving it to the Europeans in their interest and ours too. Maybe we should explain what it is, why we're doing it. So that, in a way, was an origin of public diplomacy in a grand strategic sense. During the Cold War, of course, as well, public diplomacy tended to have a strategic role in support of the containment doctrine, in support of the liberation policy. And later on, when NATO was being enlarged, in support of enlargement. And then much more recently, when Condoleezza Rice was Secretary of State, she spoke about transformational diplomacy. That is, the US would be engaging directly with foreign societies in order to encourage them through democratic processes, which the United States was promoting, to make their own governments responsible. That is, to empower the citizenry, not just in capitals, but throughout countries like Indonesia, in secondary and even tertiary cities, to be involved in the process. But these were grand, I won't call them grand strategic concepts necessarily, but they were certainly strategic. Now, I've been trying to learn a little bit about Indian public diplomacy, and I don't in any way presume to know a great deal about it. I'll mention simply an article which I came across, which is pretty good, which some of you may know. It's by Arjit Mazumdar, and published in India Quarterly in February of 2020, and is titled straightforwardly, India's Public Diplomacy in the 21st Century. What that indicates is that India also has some grand strategic, or at least strategic issues. Is India a partner? Is India an adversary? I believe Jindal Global University is going to be having a discussion of relations, conflictual ones to some degree, between India and China. India now is being, I might even say, co-opted. That's probably not the right word to use. In the Quad, that the U.S., Japan, Australia, India association, not formal, but it's a sort of an alliance of a kind, an alignment, let me call it. I mean, that would, from a Chinese perspective, look somewhat adversarial. Yet on the other hand, India, of course, would want to be ideally a partner. So there are some big strategic issues. Another which I might mention, which is maybe a little bit less strategic, is the whole matter of India's representation in the United Nations system. And I know it is and has been for a long time an objective of Indian policy and Indian diplomacy to become a permanent veto-holding member of the United Nations Security Council. And as the world's largest democracy, one of the world's largest countries, in a way, this makes perfect sense. But this reform of the United Nations Security Council hasn't happened. Now, Carnes Lord points out that not only has public diplomacy become less grand strategic, it's become more operational. It's become more operational, more routine, more process oriented. And here I would like to cite and mention again with a kind of a manual graphic, some work done by a very distinguished, very accomplished Canadian public diplomat. He has served as ambassador as well in Southeast Asia. His name is Mark McDowell. And the article which he wrote for the Fletcher Forum of World Affairs in 2008 began as a presentation that he made on the occasion of the 100th anniversary of the birth of Edward R. Murrow, after whom the Murrow Center is named. And what Mark, a good friend, describes in his article, again, the Fletcher Forum of World Affairs is a special edition in 2008, in case anybody would like to look it up. I realize I'm talking with scholars, with students, as well as others, so some of these references might be useful. Mark shows in his work a pyramid like this, with 3 levels. At the top level, this is what the public diplomacy does, its operations. At the top level is what he calls advocacy. Now, advocacy is not typically considered to be one of the functions of diplomacy. It's not mentioned as one of the functions of diplomacy in the Vienna Convention on Diplomatic Relations of 1961. Canada has been a pioneer in introducing advocacy by that word in its diplomatic posture. Canada has a very large embassy in Washington, D.C., between the White House and the Capitol. Within the embassy is an advocacy secretariat for working, lobbying with Congress, and also bringing different parts of Canada, different parts of the government to Washington, D.C. to express their interests, their needs, their purposes in the Capitol, not only with the State Department, but with members of Congress, with various committees, with other agencies and departments of the U.S. government. So this advocacy secretariat of the Canadian Embassy in Washington is a pioneering effort. And it's appropriate that a Canadian diplomat would put advocacy at the top. I think other countries do the same without calling it that. It might be considered in some places and by some countries interference in the internal affairs of other countries. At the second level of the pyramid, Mark calls it relationship building. Relationship building. What for? If relationships are formed, this creates, if you will, the capacity to partner if the occasion should rise when a partner or an ally, so to speak, is needed. And at the bottom level, the widest, Mark has included the following: branding, programming, and events. Now, branding is a term, of course, that comes from the marketing world. And quite a lot of work has been done by, among other scholars and writers on the subject, Simon Anholt. Some of you may be familiar with his work, Anholt. It does come from the marketing world. Britain has tried to brand itself. It has found it difficult to do so because Britain has images which are not necessarily compatible. They're not necessarily harmonious. On the one hand, you have traditional Britain, the Tower of London, beef eaters, the monarchy, Buckingham Palace, the Queen. And you also have modern Britain, that of Tony Blair. And then you have the software industry around Cambridge, for example. So these images are very, very different, and they jar somewhat. They don't juxtapose easily. Now, for the United States and for India, very, not only pluralistic, but extremely diverse societies, to try to present a national brand is almost impossible. For smaller countries, it might work. But for a large country, it may not. And even for smaller countries, for a government to promote a national brand can create vulnerabilities. It's like plate glass. If something goes terribly wrong, it can shatter. I think of Finland, for example, was called for a while Nokia land. Well, Nokia hasn't done too well in the competitive world, of information technology. Programming, of course, is more general. It would include exchange programs like the Fulbright program, which I've been privileged to be a part of. And then there are events. It can be something as simple as having a violinist play, in an embassy, or a person to play a piano, in a symphony hall, or a visit by a philharmonic orchestra. It can also be something very grand, like the Beijing Olympics. Of course, that was not done just for public diplomacy purposes. It had a much broader function as well for the Chinese government. But it has been, the Beijing Olympics have been studied from a public diplomatic point of view. And it's vulnerable because there was a boycott movement against it because of the treatment of the Chinese government of Tibetans at that time. And one thinks now of what is happening with the Uyghur population. So whatever China might like to do of a grand, spectacular kind of way, like the Beijing Olympics, would be vulnerable. So there are important public opinion, public diplomacy opportunities and vulnerabilities as well. Of course, this kind of thing goes back a long way. Ancient Roman Empire had bread and circuses in the Colosseum. And that was done partly to have an effect on the general mass and on the world. The very idea of the Colosseum, of course, continues to this day. The football stadium at Harvard University is in a way modeled on the Colosseum. Now, I've already hinted with reference to branding that country size does make a difference. And if I may, I'd like to share another one of Mark McDowell's images. Think of three circles, a very small one, a middle-sized one, and a very large one. And think of them, and in his article, these are green circles, dark green, kind of like olives, small, medium, and large. And in each one of these green olive-like circles is a little red dot, like the pimento pepper in an olive. And the little red dot stands for, if you will, the public diplomatic apparatus of the country. The point he makes is that for a small country, the public diplomatic apparatus, that little red dot, that pimiento, is quite large. That is, what the government does, what the Ministry of Foreign Affairs does, what the ambassadors do, what the communications people in that industry do really makes a difference for that country's image, its impact abroad. It even has an effect on how that country, the general population, sees itself internally. At the middle level, Canada, for example, it's larger, the olive is bigger, the little red circle is somewhat larger because Canada does have a lot of professionals working in that field. It's very active internationally. And for a big country like the United States or India, yes, PD, public diplomacy, the apparatus is much larger than in the small or middle-sized country. But in relation to the overall society and the emanation of the overall society internationally, it's minuscule. It's very, very small. So what the State Department can do internationally with its public diplomacy efforts in relation to what Hollywood can do, or what Microsoft or Google, or what Facebook or what Twitter can do, or what General Motors or Ford can do, is very, very small. Moreover, the size of it is kept quite small because there is competition, at least potential competition, between what the government might do to sort of sell America, the United States abroad, and what these companies are doing and would like to do. And I just learned recently, actually, from Professor Cull at the University of Southern California, that the Voice of America, which was set up way back in World War II and continues to operate to this day, the Voice of America initially wanted to broadcast via radio within the United States as well as abroad. That was resisted by AP, by the Associated Press, because the Associated Press didn't want the competition from the government. More recently, the State Department developed something called WorldNet TV. Very good product. These programs were shown internationally. This was resisted by CNN, the cable news network in the United States itself, because it didn't want CNN was reporting the world to Americans, as well as the world to itself in other parts of the globe. It didn't want that kind of competition, which makes a broader point, and I think this point is not sufficiently made in academic or other studies of public diplomacy. The economic interests of non-governmental, even governmental entities within a country can restrict what can be done usefully by the government in the field of public diplomacy. Now, so public diplomacy has evolved. It's less grand strategic, it's more operational, and it has become, this will be a third stage, though these stages do overlap. It has become more tactical and reactive. It's much more involved in crisis management. Now, some of the crises are very big, very large. One thinks, for example, inevitably for an American, what happened on September 11th, 2001, the attack on the World Trade Center in the Pentagon and the loss of the plane and lives in the state of Pennsylvania. That had a broad impact. And the media, not only the government, but the media generally, broadcast that, transmitted the impact of that to the world. But there was almost immediately in the United States the feeling, why do they hate us? Al-Qaeda, these were suicide missions. They weren't even trying to escape the perpetrators. So it was ideological. So there seemed to be something deeper behind it, than simply an attack on some buildings in New York and Washington, D.C. So this led to a lot of soul searching and a lot of work on what public diplomacy might be doing to overcome this hatred, this vague anti-American, maybe anti-West feeling in other parts of the world. And the initial effort was a failure because Madison Avenue advertising techniques were applied with an effort to broadcast to the world how well Arabs and other Muslims were doing in the United States. Elsewhere in the world, in the Middle East, for example, people knew, in Detroit, Arab Americans are doing relatively well. We know that already. But learning that, we already know it, doesn't really help us where we are, in Egypt or Pakistan or any other country where the population is young, unemployed, frustrated, against its own government, and even in relation to the United States as well. Now, COVID-19 is also a major crisis. It's a continuing one, as the crisis prompted by terrorism was as well. And public diplomacy is having to deal with that now in relation to, for example, the whole question of the distribution of vaccines. Who gets it? Who produces it? Who exports it? Who gets it and when? And who gets what type of it? Now, companies are having to deal with this, and I hope they do so with diplomatic understanding. But the government, including President Biden, is having to get involved in that sort of effort as well. Now, there are, of course, many smaller incidents that require responses by public diplomats. And one of them, I hesitate to mention it, but I did sort of study it with my students at the Fletcher School at the time. And that was what happened in 2013, the so-called Devyani Cobra Gata incident, which many of you are probably familiar with. It was a big deal in India, less so in the US. From a technical international legal perspective, it did involve the Vienna Convention on Diplomatic Relations and also the Vienna Convention on Consular Relations. And she herself, that Canadian consul, was sort of shifted to diplomatic status in order to give her greater protection. But it had many other implications as well of a cultural nature, psychological nature, which were very, very difficult for both countries to handle. Now, my third step, in a way, sort of conceptually, this is the central one, though I won't necessarily be lengthier about it. On what basis, on what international normative, legal, if you will, also organizational basis is public diplomacy conducted nationally and internationally? And here there is quite a difference between the domestic and the international. There's a very good short article on the website of the Center on Public Diplomacy at the University of Southern California by a young professor named Philip Arsenault. You can find it on the CBC website, CPD website. It's titled, International Law Provides New Context for Public Diplomacy Scholarship. This was the first thing I found when I began to research this question of what, if any, international legal context is there for public diplomacy? And what he writes, this is the introduction, it's very good. Diplomacy is a well-established tool serving the functions of international relations and statecraft, where there are codified rules and socially constructed norms by which diplomats generally abide. There is an established framework that governs the behavior of and within the diplomatic process. The same is not true of rules governing public diplomacy. In an ever complex arena of international politics, an increasingly complex and an increasingly complex information ecology filled with disinformation, the time has never been better to adopt socio-legal methodologies for exploring the practice of public diplomacy in relation to international law. This, I think, is very good. It indicates an awareness by this young scholar that there is, I wouldn't say a void, but there is an undeveloped field, a relatively uncharted field, which is the question of what is the international legal, if you will, framework, normative framework for public diplomacy. Now, at the national level, there's a lot of legislation. Things are pretty well established within countries. Within the US, I won't go into this now, it's a huge subject, and a lot's been written on it. In 1948, there was the passage of the Smith-Mundt, M-U-N-D-T Act. This was Carl Mundt, a senator from the state of Wisconsin. That's the foundational act. The Voice of America, as I indicated earlier, goes back even earlier to 1942 during the war. Now today, the Smith-Mundt Act has been modified, has been modernized, and there is the group which controls it. It's the U.S. government, it's a commission on global media, Agency for Global Media, which oversees not only the Voice of America, but other entities as well within the system. Al Hurrah and a variety of radios, radio, television Marti, going into Cuba, Radio Asia, and so on. It's an integrated network of communication services. Britain, of course, has the British Council and the BBC. Those are very well established legislatively, institutionally in Britain. France has Alliance Française. It has a radio and television network as well, which broadcasts internationally. Germany has the Goethe Institutes, Deutsche Welle, which does so as well. Other countries have these also. India has Doordarshan. China has a Chinese television and radio operation, which operates internationally, as well as the Confucius Institutes, which are becoming somewhat controversial because of their arguably intrusive nature. Now, at the international level, however, the matter is really vague, and it's much more problematic. And what I would like just very quickly to note are, to be very brief about it, first of all, the United Nations Charter, UNESCO, which I would especially emphasize, the Universal Declaration on Human Rights of the United Nations, the Vienna Convention on Diplomatic Relations of 1961, the Council of Europe, which has a European Convention on Human Rights. Ankit Malhotra, you and I were talking about that earlier. And the Helsinki Final Act of 1975, which I think has some relevance to this subject. Now, the UN Charter, of course, is broadly committed to the purpose of international harmonization, fostering friendly and good neighborly relations among countries, states in particular, for purposes of maintaining international peace and security, among others. Article 2 is very important to note in this context, also states the organization, the UN, is based on the principle of the sovereign equality of all members. And Article 2.7, paragraph 7, nothing contained in the present charter shall authorize the United Nations to intervene in matters which are essentially within the jurisdiction, the domestic jurisdiction of any state, or shall require the members to submit such matters to settlement under the present charter. But this principle shall not prejudice the application of enforcement measures under Chapter 7. That's when the Security Council decides, with the unanimous support of the Permanent Five, that a certain matter threatens international peace and security, following which collective action, sanctions, and even military force can be used. But that's the only way out of escaping this prohibition on interference in the domestic affairs of countries. Now, that's fundamentally important and explains the difficulty of creating some sort of international legitimacy for what could be considered intrusive public diplomatic activity, either in person through organizational involvement or by radio and television broadcasting, or use of social media via the internet abroad. Now, UNESCO, which is an organization I hadn't initially thought of in this context, is now, I think, really important as a source of normative quality, which infuses, if you will, it's a phrase that you have used earlier, Ankit, the ecosystem, of global affairs in the communications field. Archibald MacLeish was an American poet. He was Undersecretary of State for a time. He was head of the Library of Congress for a time. He was the head of the United States delegation to the conference in London that established the Constitution of UNESCO, the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization. A statement that he made was read into the record of a hearing before the United States Congress, the House of Representatives. And the couple of brief quotations, these are very good, and I think his being a poet, I think is evident here. The agreement of nations themselves to work together through all the channels of communication and with all the universal languages of science, art, and learning to increase their understanding of each other and to root out the prejudice and ignorance which have separated them in the past is a new thing in the history of international undertakings. That's quite a statement. MacLeish went on to say that worldwide understanding is essential to the hope for peace, that in a world armed with weapons of such terrible destructiveness as those which men contrived during the last war, and of course Hiroshima and Nagasaki had just occurred, the only hope for peace lies in the mutual understanding not of foreign offices alone, but of the peoples themselves. And the preamble to the Constitution of UNESCO points out that wars stem from conditions of suspicion and mistrust between the peoples of the world. I'm indebted to these references to the scholar of public diplomacy, Matt Armstrong. So if Matt happens to see this or hear this now or at some point, thank you very much. It connects with what I was saying earlier about at the extreme, Manuel Castell's emphasis that diplomacy, that public diplomacy is people's diplomacy. But again, I would emphasize there should be a policy, focus, interest. The policy can be very broad, human rights, environment, health, and so on. But there should be an understanding of the pluralism inherent in international society. The Vienna Convention, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights has, I won't read it, but it's Article 19. It emphasizes the right of people to receive and impart information and ideas through any media, and regardless of frontiers. I think that should be factored into, if you will, the milieu, the normative context of public diplomacy. Importantly, the Vienna Convention on diplomatic relations. Now that originated, and this may be of particular interest to those of you who are lawyers. That document was produced by the International Law Commission. And I happen to remember, because I've read some of the proceedings of it in the official records, that the representative of India was Arthur Lal, whom I once had the privilege of meeting in New York, where he lived. He had been India's representative to the United Nations. One of the big issues at this conference in Vienna in 1961 was representation. Those who were invited to participate in the drafting of the Vienna Convention on Diplomatic Relations were member states of the United Nations. That included at the time the Republic of China, that is Taiwan, the Republic of China. The Soviet representative, a very intelligent, knowledgeable international lawyer named Grigory Tunkin, argued that the Vienna Convention on Diplomatic Relations, this code, should be universal in character. It should not be limited. And the People's Republic of China should be included. North Korea should be included. This, of course, was objected to by the American position. Apropos the relationship between India and China, which I know is a continuing one and a complex one, sort of between adversary and partner, if you will, and I know you're going to be discussing that, comes to mind when I read this very brief paragraph summarizing a point that Arthur Lal made. Lal, Mr. Lal, India, said that his delegation did not intend to question the adequacy of the invitations to the conference, which were governed by Resolution 1450, that is, the invitation to members of the UN organization. But he considered that the Republic of China, with a capital R and a capital C, which had been invited to the conference, could only be represented by the effective government of China, which of course at that time, after 1949, was the People's Republic of China, the communist government. He didn't say much else, but I thought that was particularly interesting. Now, Article 27 of the Vienna Convention is the one that's most pertinent to this whole subject. And there's a very good commentary on it by Eileen Denza, Professor Denza, who also had been the legal advisor. You and I, Ankit, were talking earlier about, you've mentioned diplomatic and consular law, which I know is something studied at Jindal Global Law School. The receiving state shall permit and protect free communication on the part of the mission for all official purposes. In communicating with the government and other missions and consulates of the sending state, wherever situated, the mission may employ all appropriate means, including diplomatic couriers and messages in code or cipher. However, the mission may install and use wireless transmitter only with the consent of the receiving state. Now, she emphasizes in her commentary, this is quite right, of course, that for a mission to be able to communicate with its own government and also with the host government requires secure communications. Otherwise, it can't perform its diplomatic function. Now, this question of establishing wireless facilities is very important because the technology of communications has changed a lot. 1961, of course, was at the height of the Cold War. The United States and other governments didn't want there to be broadcasts from diplomatic missions in capitals to society, to the host society, to the people. The US government was already not only through Voice of America, but through Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty, broadcasting by shortwave, into the Soviet sphere, if you will. So this was a very, very sensitive subject, and it remains so. Exactly what kinds of communications facilities should be permitted to governments in establishing their embassies and other installations, including consulates and consulates abroad. Now, the Council of Europe also has some normative language. This is, of course, only a regional, but it does include the Russian Federation. Article 10 states, everyone has the right to freedom of expression. This right shall include freedom to hold opinions and to receive and impart information and ideas without interference by public authority and regardless of frontiers. However, this article shall not prevent states from requiring the licensing of broadcasting, television, or cinema enterprises. That document, too, was carefully written with the plurality of countries involved in mind. Countries with very different governmental systems and very different social systems. The Russians, the Soviet Union, did, of course, agree to this. This dates from 1949. And the Russian Federation, like all other signatories, is bound to this as well. Now, the Helsinki Final Act, Basket 3, also is pertinent to this. Article 10 especially emphasizes the importance of freedom of communication, freedom of information. And the Helsinki Final Act has been used by various Helsinki watch groups to sort of hold government's feet to the fire with regard to these matters. Now, I'd like to move to step 4, challenges in the global communication sphere, past and present, in which diplomacy, including public diplomacy, has to be conducted. And I would just point out at the outset of this part of the discussion that under conditions of COVID-19, diplomacy has been put under a lot of pressure. In a way, public diplomacy has an advantage to the extent that it is conducted remotely, whereas conventional diplomacy, traditional diplomacy, has classically been in person at meetings, including summit meetings. But increasingly, as The Economist pointed out in a very interesting article on May 1st of this year, diplomacy has changed more than most professions during the pandemic. COVID-19 has hastened the arrival of hybrid diplomacy, a blend of the physical and digital. And the article mentions that President Biden, after becoming president, held his first summit meeting, with a counterpart as head of government, Justin Trudeau, even though the countries are next door neighbors. It was done virtually, remotely. He met as well with the four leaders of the Quad, with India, Japan, Australia, and the United States, remotely. All of his initial meetings were done remotely. So this is a major change, and it can be called hybrid diplomacy. Of course, hybrid, the balance of in-person and remote is, of course, one which is constantly changing. Now, some of the challenges to diplomacy are not new. First of all, there's jamming. And the Russian government during the Cold War jammed broadcasts from the US. Not directly from the US, but from Munich in Germany. Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty. The Voice of America was very popular among the Russian people, mainly because a famous man named Willis Conover had a jazz program, and the Voice of America was less propagandistic, much less, in fact, than Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty, which were really aimed at liberation. And then, of course, is physical violence against diplomacy. One thinks, for example, of the takeover in Iran of the American embassy in 1979, which is a direct violation of the Vienna Convention on Diplomatic Relations. That was a real challenge, one of the first major ones in our own time to diplomacy. More recently, with what's happened in Afghanistan, this huge American embassy was overrun, as were most other embassies at the time. That, of course, not only has interfered with diplomacy, but it's been a direct challenge to the diplomatic system. Traditional diplomacy, I'm sorry about this telephone, direct diplomacy conducted by diplomats, as well as those that might be involved, in outreach to universities, connecting with corporations, businesses, labor unions, religious groups, and so on. Then there is blocking of websites, which happens quite a lot, not only in China, North Korea, Russia as well, but it's happening more and more often. And then there's this matter of licensing. I touched upon that earlier. This has always been allowed. The Russian government has passed a foreign agent law, which requires all recipients of foreign funds in Russia to reveal that they have received those funds, and they become considered beneficiaries of foreign agents. This has had a chilling effect, to say the least, on agencies, including some that have been there for a long time, like the British Consul, which has been there for decades, which finally was informed not too long ago that it was being obligated to leave the country because of Russian policy. China, which has not really had traditionally under the PRC much foreign NGO activity at all. Of course, in the 19th century, there were missionaries, but in part because of that missionary activity, they haven't been welcomed. But in recent decades, there has been some NGO activity, of course, business activity as well, because there's a lot of foreign production occurring there, contracted with Chinese companies. But China now has a law of the People's Republic of China on the administration of activities of overseas non-governmental organizations in the mainland of China. NGOs must register with the Chinese Ministry of Public Security before they can establish an office. And, quote, they must not endanger China's national security, national unity, or ethnic unity. That's an obvious reference to some of the particularly Muslim minority groups. And they must not engage in religious activity. One can see, especially Hong Kong is kind of the epicenter of this right now, of this security, this national security perspective of the Chinese government has come to dominate everything in China involving foreign presence and foreign activity. And it's really very serious. It is a major challenge to what might be called, as I have done, the global communication space. Then, of course, there's hacking, which is a recurrent problem. It usually being unclear who's doing it. Governments say that Putin says, I'm not doing it. You know, it may conceivably happen from within Russia, but the Russian government is not responsible. Then there's outright disinformation as well. And fake news is becoming a real problem. The Voice of America has always prided itself on telling the truth. Edward R. Murrow famously said, credible diplomacy, to be believable, it must be credible. And in order to be credible, it has to be truthful. Truth is the best public diplomacy. So disinformation campaigns, fake news, deliberate fake news calls into question even which is that which had been and should be considered still to be objective, truthful, and factual. Now, maybe these challenges amount to what can even be called more broadly hybrid warfare. You know, are we in a kind of hybrid war? Nick Hull at the University of Southern California has said what we need is disarmament, something like disarmament that has occurred in the military field, conscious, diplomatically conducted arms control, disarmament efforts in the field of communications conflict. Now, finally, the last step, responses. How effective are the responses that have been made? And most importantly, given my central consideration, does the normative international context matter? My answer to that question, my own question, is emphatically yes. It matters profoundly, even for digital diplomacy, which can be conducted from home. The international framework, the normative framework, if you will, the international morality governing public diplomacy as well as diplomacy more generally is really important. Now, most of the world's responses to these challenges have been responses made at the national level. Governments are doing a lot to protect their own communication space. In some cases, even violating, their own standards in order to secure themselves. In the United States, the Department of Homeland Security has been tasked with the obligation to address the problem of cybersecurity, which has been identified by President Biden as a core concern of US policy at the present time. There is within that department a cybersecurity and infrastructure security agency. At the regional level also, quite a bit is being done. The European Union has an agency for cybersecurity. And with regard to disinformation, the European Union has developed and is now trying to strengthen a code of practice on disinformation. This is a self-regulation code. Companies involved in electronic and other communications are expected, called upon to regulate themselves. But there's a feeling which is increasing in Europe that this needs to be strengthened. That self-regulation itself may not be enough. It might be necessary and may be very difficult to achieve to establish a code or codes, regulations which are binding upon the corporations and others involved, in that sphere. So this is something to be watched, what the European Union is doing in that field. Now, NATO has gone pretty far. NATO is now directly involved in what it calls cyber defense. It's considered to be one of the core tasks of NATO now within the context of its collective defense. It is now stated formally by NATO that NATO considers the whole question of cybersecurity to be relevant in an international law context, that international law applies to cyberspace as well as to territory and to the oceans. This is very significant because it could mean that Article 5, the Mutual Defense Article, which could involve the use of force, could be invoked should there be a cyber attack, like the one on Estonia some years ago. This is extremely important. Jens Stoltenberg, the Secretary General of NATO, conducted a cyber defense pledge in London a couple of years ago. So a major commitment is being made in that field. And NATO also now has even cyber readiness teams, cyber reaction readiness teams ready to act and to do so in cooperation with the European Union. So this too is something to be watched. Now, at the global level, there's of course nothing quite comparable. The International Telecommunications Union is of course part of the, if you will, the infrastructure within which international communications takes place. This is a very old organization, going back to the Telegraph Union in the 19th century. It is doing its best now to contribute to the building of global cybersecurity resilience, a term which is being used a lot these days. And it actually offers instruction leading to a cybersecurity certificate. The United Nations is also involved. It's the UN Office of Counterterrorism in particular that's engaged. It has a cybersecurity and new technologies program. And then there is a group which existed from 2017 to 2019 called the Global Commission on the Stability of Cyberspace. Its chair was actually a Fletcher School graduate, Marina Kaljarand, former foreign minister of Estonia, a country which was cyber attacked, where Skype was invented, among other things. It's a very tech-savvy country. And what that Global Commission has done is to try to create, which it has done, to create diplomatic norms of non-aggression in cyberspace. And one of the commissioners of this commission, Marietje Schaake from the Netherlands, a Dutch member of the European Parliament, has helped with a colleague to establish a Cyber Peace Institute. So peace efforts are being made, in this field, not only to disarm, but to actually foster peace in that area. Now, to wrap up and to do so very succinctly, one thinks of the Taliban in Afghanistan that has taken over the country physically and is going to have to conduct a government there, as it did try to do so unsuccessfully earlier for a brief period of time. It is going to want to have access to the international aviation system. it's going to want to have the cooperation of the International Civil Aviation Organization in Montreal. It is currently trying not only to get recognized by countries individually. A few have done so. I think Pakistan has done so. I think United Arab Emirates has done so as well, because of all the diplomatic activity taking place there between some of the Western countries, the US included, and the Taliban. The Taliban organization is now, government, if you will, is trying to get credentialed at the United Nations. And the question is, who represents Afghanistan? The sitting permanent representative, or should the Taliban get involved? There needs to be clearly an evolution of Taliban conduct. The word conditionality probably will be used to make clear what adjustments need to be made. In time, it may happen, but its ability to do so, its effort to do so, will succeed only within the context of the international, normative, legal organizational context framework, the ecosystem, which you, Ankit, have mentioned. And it's very important that the fabric of that be maintained for all governments and all peoples to be involved in peaceful, harmonious discourse. I think I should stop there.
Thank you so much, sir. It was riveting, and hearing you speak took me back to Fletcher's, albeit I was there for a month. But so riveting was the experience and so thought provoking was it. And to hear you speak was like going back to class, going back to the classroom with the. It's unfortunate we didn't have a drawing board here, but to see the scribbles which you made were illustrious, and there's still fragments of not only time but also thought etched in our memories. I do share Denza. I have a copy of Eileen Denza's work over here,
Uh-huh.
and
Good for you.
and I, reading Denza, I recollect Professor Henrikson literally shoving the VCDR in our faces because he stressed upon the importance of the conventions and how much importance they attach to diplomatic relations. We as students got an idea of it, but when I was studying Denza, did I actually realize the importance of the conventions? And I was so thankful to Professor Henrikson for organizing those lectures and for instilling the values that Denza furthers. Of course, this field is also dotted with other illustrious female scholars, namely Hazel Fox and Philippa Webb. Now, Philippa Webb is someone that I will be speaking to next week, and I should be more than happy to bring this up. Might I also share that Devyani Khobragade is now ambassador, so you might as well address her as Her Excellency. She's now ambassador for Cambodia. The other
Good.
point which I wanted to raise was, and I have a couple, and then I will yield the floor and invite others to also ask their questions. First is being the centers of propaganda. Uh, there is not only Doordarshan, but there is also the Nehru Centers for diplomacy and cultural relations that India has. But none remain as powerful and as potent as the British Council and also the Alliance Francaise. But one is what is challenging, and as Professor is the Chinese version of these, which are also perhaps too intrusive. I also share the point which was raised by Professor on the NGOs, these being specifically the Center for Constitutional Rights, an American NGO which provides legal briefs to states regarding George Bush's responsibilities for torture and the responsibility which is taken up by the UN Global Compact program, which encourages firmly to adopt voluntary standards of labor and environmental practices. This is an article which was shared with us as a core reading and is by Ian Bird. I shall be more than happy to share the further details. The last point which I wish to make, and I would require Professor to share his opinions on this. This is a book which was written by a historian. This historian is called Neil Ferguson. And what Ferguson does is perhaps the thesis of public diplomacy, and he does it through a lot of different variants, but his favorite, and he devotes two books to him as well separately, and this is Henry Kissinger. Now, what Ferguson talks about is networks and networks as nexuses. Ferguson positions networks at the basis of human innovation, arguing that they allowed us to have constructs of modern civilization. In this respect, Ferguson observes that networks are extremely varied, including patterns of settlement and migration in the early days of humanity, but also cults and crazes through the sprouts with which we are now a part of. He attempted to explain the differences between networks and hierarchies, which are based on how we perceive the hubs and nodes of connecting people. In his book, he actually does this in a pictorial representation of Henry Kissinger and the relationship he shared with his Soviet counterparts, and how further away the US president was in this nexus vis-a-vis Henry Kissinger himself. So, and the last point which I want to raise, which Professor raised at the absolute end of his address, is how do you reconcile and how do you adapt to these 21st century hybrid regimes? And with this respect, I look more specifically at the Afghanistan example, but also Myanmar example, because let's not forget that some of these persons are actually on the UN sanctions list, and these are persons who are most wanted criminals. But to reconcile, and not only reconcile but also interact with these actors, is extremely important. This is extremely important not only for states like the United States of America, but also India, because India has devoted substantial financial aid to Afghanistan and is literally invested in its democracy. Need I say anything further than investing in its very own parliament? But what I, as a student of law and diplomacy, feel is most unfortunate is that India has not been able to adopt a policy which is as potent and as strong as that of China or the United States of America or the United Kingdom or even France. This is because the Indian Foreign Services is not as powerful as it ought to be. Professor Henrikson's former student, Dr. Tharoor, commented once that it is because of the size of the Indian Foreign Services that we are not capable of doing this. He cited the famous example of the US delegation coming with 20, the Chinese coming with 550, and the Indians having only 2 or 3. This is the unfortunate fate in which the Indian Foreign Services finds itself in. I will now park my comments, and I request Professor to share his views on the many points that I have shared, and I would request others to share their questions in the chat box in the interim.
Well, may I perhaps just pick up on a couple of them? One concerns what you were saying about networks, and you mentioned Professor Neil Ferguson's work. There's a very good chapter by the Israeli scholar Eitan Gilboa, whose work some of you may be familiar with. He's from Bar Ilan University in Israel. And he did the chapter on digital diplomacy in the Sage Handbook of Diplomacy, which is one of the best broad, inclusive books on the subject. I might mention that I did the chapter on American diplomacy. And he says this, he writes this, and it's pretty good, I think, and it does touch upon networks and the implications of networks, as Manuel Castells has done, as he wrote a book called The Network Society. Professor Gilboa writes the following: information and communication technologies, ICTs, have created a global connectivity that has challenged diplomacy, but also created opportunities for more effective and innovative practice. This connectivity has facilitated two-way communication between governments and foreign practice. That I didn't emphasize earlier with my manual diagram of G and the G's and the S's. I didn't emphasize heavily, at least, the two-way dimension of this. The ICT revolution has enabled the two-way communication aspect of what's happening now. between governments and foreign publics, between peoples and governments, and between and among peoples themselves. Diplomats can now reach and engage large audiences, and citizens, not even through organizations, can influence foreign policy and diplomacy as never before. They can also employ ICTs for listening to the wishes, praise, criticism, and reservations of both domestic and foreign audiences. That is, they can learn, they can listen, they can watch. This is something Professor Nicholas Cull has emphasized. That is the passive receptive quality of public diplomacy, which isn't just a matter of putting out or communicating with others. This has altered the global power structure networking has done. Networking has altered the global power structure. And in a way, the people are in charge now. You know, as Archibald MacLeish argued way back in 1945, 1946, when UNESCO was being set up, wars occurred in the 20th century because of popular attitudes, ultimately. You know, that the leaders were elected, you know, by publics. And that peace has to be achieved by the peoples. And to the extent that diplomats, traditionally defined, and diplomats as organizations, as NGOs, and diplomats as individuals are involved diplomatically in a diplomatic process, it might be possible to achieve that. Now, with regard to Afghanistan and Myanmar, you mentioned India in particular, and I'm aware, of course, it's somewhat controversial, especially from a Pakistani point of view, India's interest in Afghanistan, including investment there. And of course, the United States has trillions of dollars invested there. You know, most of it almost completely wasted now. And that probably has happened to India as well. What do we do about that? I mean, use the word reconcile. You know, how do we reconcile with, say, the SLORC government, you know, or with the Taliban? As a historian, I can't help but think the Vienna Convention on Diplomatic Relations, which Eileen Denza and others have studied and have annotated, of 1961 occurred at the height, shortly before the Cuban Missile Crisis, of the Cold War. These were different political systems. Russia had done awful things. Arguably, the United States had done awful things with Hiroshima and Nagasaki, justified or not, depending upon one's point of view. It's not an easy subject. Roosevelt and Churchill met with Joseph Stalin. So when one looks over a longer period of time at the history of diplomacy, we deal with bad guys. You know, we keep them at arm's length. They're sort of, we don't have to be chummy with them, but nonetheless, this can happen. Now, to be more realistic and perhaps operational, from the point of view of the US government and many other governments too, and I would say the European Union also, the default response to situations like Myanmar and Afghanistan, the Taliban there, being in charge there, the default response is sanctions, the application of sanctions, blocking the travel, blocking the bank accounts of individuals. And the Security Council of the United Nations has a sanctions committee, you know, and the US government and the EU, it's all, and other governments can actually choose whom individually they decide to sanction. That may be one partial way out. That is to deal with spokespersons with whom uh, Ambassador Khalilzad, for example, has dealt to deal with them individually, not necessarily, at least for the time being, and maybe for quite a period of time, as the official representative of the Afghan state or the emirate or whatever it might be called. But there are all sorts of other ways of meeting informally through representational offices, through interest sections, with a supervising power, which conceivably the United Arab Emirates could be, for the Taliban regime. The UAE has embassies abroad. Conceivably, it could be a protecting power, for a Taliban mission, like the Palestinian Liberation Organization. So there are a lot of, I won't call them models, but there are lots of exemplars, if you will. Not all of them positive, in the history of diplomacy, such that it might be possible to interact effectively, diplomatically, not in the most formal kind of way, in a morally creditable way, but nonetheless in a functional way. So in the context of the application of sanctions or the non-application of sanctions, this might be one way forward. And in a way, this is at the slightly more granular level, a characteristic of the international normative legal organizational order, of which I've been speaking in a much more abstract way. So yes, the time will come sooner rather than later in which it's necessary to deal with the Taliban. The American representative dealing with the Taliban now is William Burns, who was ambassador to Russia earlier and was the Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs and Deputy Secretary of State, head of the CIA. So he's, in a way, America's, in a sense, best diplomat right now. He's having no problem dealing with the Taliban.
Well, just to add to that, and there's a question in the chat box as well. This is Arya Anand. He's a student member of the society, and what he's asking is related to what you've just answered. He's asking if there is a state projection to present itself as a liberal elitist with a firm mission of improving the situation, but later on in its official documentation says otherwise, or internally in its domestic politics offers a different opinion or a slanted version of the truth, if you will. How does one read that, or how does that project on an international sphere when everything thus becomes quite transparent?
Ankit, could I ask you to sort of restate the question, because I'm not sure that I really took aboard the essence of it.
Okay, so perhaps it's better if I read it out. So it says that terms like micro diplomacy and subnational representation on the international stage is what he reads. But what he wants to ask is that if within a nation we have states projecting very different image from that of a whole in itself, then is there a way, or is there any way that the counterproductive force and leaving the nation will be more prone to opposition from other international players? So essentially he's trying to ask about the hypocrisy which states adopt in international policy and international foreign policy more specifically.
That's a very interesting question. And for those who may be interested in, let me say, the bibliography of the subject, there's some work that has been done by Panyotos Soldatos and some others on what has been termed para-diplomacy. which would include micro diplomacy, or city diplomacy, or state or provincial diplomacy. Now, within the United States right now, between the two broadly described red states and blue states, there are some very distinct policy differences over matters of like birth control, immigration, voting rights, and so on. Some of these states, in fact, possibly even a majority of these states now or in the past, or certainly in the future, will have representational offices abroad. Normally, the purposes of those representational offices within the European Union, for example, or possibly in Japan, is the promotion of investment, the promotion of business, to some degree cultural relations. There are sister city relationships, which go back a long way, as you probably know. The Canadian government, and I touched upon this earlier, when I mentioned the Canadian government's pioneering of what it calls advocacy. It has an advocacy secretariat in Washington, D.C. Not only does it advocate Canada's position on such matters as climate change, immigration and the like, trade mostly, but it also coordinates the activity, the diplomatic activity, and maybe even the policy positions of the various provinces. Of course, Canada is also a vast country, and say British Columbia has a huge interest in the timber industry. So it becomes necessary for the Canadian embassy in Washington, D.C. to represent not only the interests of Canada as a whole, but these various sectors that may have economic and other interests which are quite different. Of course, Quebec is a francophone province. Quebec is also, it has a Ministry of Intergovernmental Relations for dealing with other provinces and also dealing with countries of the Organisation de la Francophonie around the world, directly with the French government. Now, these North American countries on foreign policy matters don't have radical differences of opinion. I don't know to what degree, if at all, there are significant policy differences between and among the different states, of the country of India. But one can well imagine increasingly with micro diplomacy, with the rise of subnational formal entities getting involved, some of whose leaders are quite demagogic. That's how they got elected, and may project widely throughout the world, not necessarily knowledgeably or diplomatically, but what they're saying and doing may be picked up by others outside that country in a way that is considered by those who read or hear or see on television, whatever is being projected by these people, as representing, say, an Indian point of view, with regard to social disparities or episodes involving violence of various kinds, which may be related to social and cultural and religious differences. So this whole complex of problems is, I think, one that's likely to be front and center for us. And I think the question that is posed was prescient, let me say.
So we've only got 10 minutes left. We're close to 9 o'clock. We just have one final question. I'll request the question to be short and answer also, please. Professor.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ankit. And thank you very much, Professor Henrikson. I've studied at Fletcher, and now I realize how much I missed by not attending your classes, because the clarity with which you put concepts together is paramount. So thanks a lot for all these. So I'll be straightforward. And my question was, I really like the point at which you marked, or you pointed out a shift from grand strategy to a more operational or tactical level, right, of the public diplomacy.
Yeah.
I understand it and I can see that, but while you were talking, I was thinking of the 21st century American administrations, right? And the footprint they left in, let's say, the foreign policy, but not for the American public, but for the world. And I'm contrasting Bush, Obama, Trump, Biden. Don't you think there might be a comeback of grand strategy that the world needs to understand what the US is trying to do through its foreign policy? I mean, because I'm thinking of the withdrawal from Afghanistan. I'm thinking of Barack Obama's red line when he addressed al-Assad threatening, well, I understood it as a threat for the use of force if chemical weapons had been used. Those kind of things. Don't you think there might be a comeback of public diplomacy in the realm of grand strategy for the world to understand what America is doing as the beacon that many of us regard it?
It's a very challenging question. There is, and I know our time is limited, there is a kind of void right now in American foreign policy. Its purpose is not clear. We've gone through a period in which the national interest, the American interest, America first, has been placed before the American public as being what the US interest and role in the world should be. I have thought for a long time that there is also something called the American international interest. The American international interest. And with regard, for example, to the COVID pandemic, it's very clear that Americans can't be healthy unless the world is healthy. The US has an international interest in that, and it's beyond nation states. It's global. The US has a global interest. That doesn't mean you have to be a globalist, you know, in the old-fashioned sense of being an idealist about world government and the like. So it may be in that kind of way that we have to think about grand strategy, which actually, to me, is a very dated term. It dates from World War II. And the whole point of it was that the entire country would be mobilized. You know, the General Motors would build tanks, and the people would forego using butter and so on. And they wouldn't have rubber for the tires of their cars. They couldn't buy a lot of domestic products, sort of a total commitment. The word was used a lot in World War II, and it's been picked up by, well, at Yale University. There's some controversy about its program and grand strategy right now. We've had scholars and students at the Fletcher School who have studied and are studying grand strategy. I don't myself think, as a historian, seeing how these concepts like public diplomacy change, that the term grand strategy, which after all is a strategy for a particular government. And what we really need now are collective strategies. You can see this a bit within the European Union, which is struggling, within NATO. The United Nations is having great difficulty deciding what its strategic priorities are. But I think if there is an organizational frame within which this conceivably could be done, it is the United Nations organization. But that requires a multilateral commitment on the parts of not just governments, but peoples. And the American public is not particularly multilateralist right now. I suspect that you Fede, I look forward to meeting you in person, might be.
Well,
Thank you
our
very much.
university, our
Yeah,
university, Jindal Global University. So it's our namesake to be global and also to aspire global values, as does the Fletcher School of Diplomacy. With those words, Professor, let me thank you. It's been exceptionally uh, riveting and also thought-provoking to hear you once again. And we hope that we will stay in touch. And I look forward to welcoming you to our university, as you did, with open arms and open minds. It was a riveting experience then, and it has been now. Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts and your vision. We're truly inspired, and thank you, our participants, as well, for joining this discussion. Thank you, everyone. We shall convene with another lecture, with another speaker next week. Thank you all. Thank you so much, Professor Henrikson. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Ankit, and everyone. I'm
Thank you.
reachable by email in case anybody would like to be in touch.